He only wanted a cup of coffee, but the bracelet on his wrist carried a story that would stop a mother in her tracks. What happens when a simple diner encounter reopens a door to the past and forces two families to face the weight of sacrifice, memory, and healing? The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first trucks rumbled past the little diner off Highway 90. Their engines echoed against the flat Texas fields, scattering birds from the fence posts and shaking dust into the air. Inside, the place still smelled of yesterday's bacon grease and strong coffee. The red vinyl booths were mostly empty, save for two ranchers who always came in before dawn. Behind the counter, Nancy wiped down mugs with the steady rhythm of someone who had done the same thing for decades. Her knees ached that morning, but she pushed through as always. After 40 years on her feet, she wore her routine like armor. Coffee pot in one hand, towel in the other. A smile ready for whoever walked through the door. It was work, yes, but the diner had long been more than that. It was a piece of her life she hadn't let go, even after her husband passed, even after her son never came home from Afghanistan. The bell over the door jingled, and Nancy looked up. A young man stepped inside, brushing dust from his boots. He couldn't have been more than 25, with a lean build and shoulders set stiff, as though he carried something heavier than his small backpack. His military haircut was still sharp at the edges, though grown out just enough to suggest he wasn't active duty anymore. His eyes scanned the room quickly, habit, not curiosity, and then he chose a booth near the window. Nancy poured a fresh mug before he even asked. She carried it over, setting it on the table with her usual warmth. "Coffee's strong today," she said. "Hope you like it that way." The young man managed a small smile. "Strong's good. Thank you." His voice was quiet, polite, but Nancy noticed the way he kept his hands close, like he wasn't used to relaxing in unfamiliar places. She had seen that before in men coming home from war. Her son's friends had looked that way once. She turned to leave, but something caught her eye. On his wrist was a woven band of green paracord, simple and rugged, with a small silver bead threaded into it. She froze. Her breath caught. The bead was engraved with two delicate letters, J.R. The room seemed to sway as though the floor had shifted beneath her. Her hand clutched the back of the booth for balance. She hadn't seen one of those bracelets in over a decade. Her son, Jacob Ramsey, had made them before he deployed, sitting at the kitchen table with lengths of paracord, teaching her how the knots worked while he laughed about Marines needing hobbies. He'd made half a dozen of them, gave them out to his friends, tucked one into her purse when she wasn't looking. After he died overseas, those bracelets had disappeared into the lives of the men who survived. She never thought she'd see one again. Nancy swallowed hard and forced her voice steady. "Where did you get that bracelet?" The young man looked down, startled, as though he'd forgotten it was even there. He ran a thumb across the bead before answering. "My dad gave it to me." She stepped closer. "That's not just any bracelet. My son made those. Jacob Ramsey. 13 years ago." The young man's expression shifted, first confusion, then recognition. His jaw tightened. He sat up straighter. "Jacob Ramsey? Ma'am, your son was with my dad in Afghanistan." The ranchers in the corner fell silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade as Nancy stared at him. "What's your name?" "Daniel Harper," he said. "My dad's Sergeant Mark Harper. He was in Jacob's unit." Nancy's knees went weak. She lowered herself into the booth across from him without asking. Her hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot. "Your father—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "Jacob saved 2 men the night he didn't come home. One of them was your dad." Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't meet her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. Dad told me the story my whole life. He was pinned inside a burning vehicle when Jacob pulled him out. My dad said Jacob never hesitated. He carried him out while rounds were still flying. He always said he owed his life to your son." Nancy's palm pressed hard against her lips, as if she could dam the flood inside her. Still, a tear carved its way free. Memories surged. The knock on the door, the folded flag, the silence afterward. She had lived with the knowledge that Jacob died a hero, but hearing it from this young man's lips made it real in a new way. Daniel unclasped the bracelet, sliding it across the table. "This has been in my family ever since. My dad gave it to me when I turned 18, said I should carry it until I understood what it meant. I wear it every day." Nancy stared at it, the green cord frayed in places, the silver bead worn smooth by years of touch. It was like holding a piece of Jacob again. Her chest tightened. "Why come here? Why now?" Daniel hesitated. His voice dropped. "Dad's sick. He wanted me to find you, to thank you for him. He always said he couldn't look you in the eye without breaking. But he wanted you to know Jacob's name still lives in our house. Every meal, every birthday, every chance I have, that's because of him." The ranchers looked down at their plates, giving the two privacy. The cook poked his head out of the kitchen, curious, then retreated. It was as though the diner itself bowed into silence, holding space for the moment. Nancy reached across the table and touched Daniel's hand, her fingers brushing the bracelet. Her voice broke. "I thought the world forgot him." Daniel shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am. Not in our family. Not ever." For the first time in years, Nancy felt warmth push through the cold stone of her grief. Sitting across from her was proof that Jacob's sacrifice wasn't swallowed by time. It had shaped a family, carried a man into fatherhood, and now lived on in this son. The coffee between them grew cold, but neither moved. Nancy knew this was only the beginning of something, though she couldn't yet name it. The bracelet was not just a reminder of loss. It was a thread pulling two lives together, across years and silence, to a table in a small Texas diner where the past was suddenly alive again. The diner grew busier as the morning went on. Trucks pulled into the gravel lot, their brakes sighing as drivers came in for eggs, bacon, and the comfort of hot coffee. By 9 o'clock, the place buzzed with the hum of conversation, the scrape of forks on plates, and the hiss of the griddle in the kitchen. Yet at the booth by the window, time felt strangely suspended. Nancy hadn't moved far since Daniel Harper had first told her who he was. The weight of his story lingered between them, too heavy to set aside. She refilled his mug, but neither of them spoke much at first. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory from decades of serving, while her mind tried to catch up with what her heart already felt. Her son's life still echoed in ways she hadn't imagined. Daniel sat with his back straight, as though the years of stories about Jacob demanded he show proper respect. But every so often, his composure faltered, his thumb brushing the tabletop, his eyes darting toward the door, as if afraid of having said too much. Finally, Nancy broke the silence. "Your father, he told you about that night often?" Daniel nodded. "More than once. Some stories he only shared when he was drinking. Others he made me memorize. Said it was the closest thing I'd ever have to meeting the man who gave me my life." He leaned forward, voice dropping low so only she could hear. "He said Jacob didn't shout orders, didn't panic. He just acted, pulled two men out. My dad never forgot how calm he looked, like saving them was the only choice." Nancy swallowed. She could almost picture Jacob's steady hands, the same calm he had carried even as a boy, fixing engines in the garage or steadying her nerves when bills piled up. But hearing Daniel speak of it twisted something inside her. Pride and sorrow tangled so tightly inside her that she could no longer tell one from the other. The diner's door opened again, and a man in a faded leather jacket stepped inside. His hair was gray at the temples, his walk stiff. He froze when he spotted Nancy and the young man at her booth. After a long moment, he came over. "Ma'am," he said softly, touching the brim of his cap. "Hope I'm not intruding, but I couldn't help hearing." Nancy looked up, surprised. She recognized him vaguely. Cal Bennett, a local who had worked odd jobs after coming back from Iraq. He had been one of the quiet ones, drifting in and out of the diner without much to say. "You knew my son?" she asked. Cal's jaw worked before he answered. "Not directly, but I was at the forward operating base down the road from Jacob's unit. Word about what he did, it spread quick. Men still talk about it even now." He pulled out a chair slowly, almost asking permission. If it's all right, I'd like to sit. Daniel shifted, surprised. Nancy nodded. Cal settled into the seat, his eyes landing on the bracelet lying between them. His breath caught. I haven't seen one of those since, Lord, since 2011. He leaned forward, voice rough. I lost 2 friends that year. Jacob wasn't one of them, but his name came up every time folks tried to remember what courage looked like. People don't always understand. Sometimes what keeps you going over there isn't orders or medals. It's the guy beside you. Jacob had that. He gave people hope just by being steady. Nancy's throat tightened. For 13 years she had carried Jacob's story like a hidden scar, buried behind diner counters and long, sleepless nights. But now strangers were piecing together his memory in front of her, as though her son had been larger than she dared to imagine. Other customers began to notice the gathering. A man at the counter leaned over, listening closely. One of the ranchers from earlier approached, hat in hand. Ma'am, my nephew served in that same region. He used to mention a Ramsey. Said he was the kind of Marine others trusted without question. Nancy blinked back tears. She had never asked about Jacob beyond what the casualty officers told her. It had been too raw, too painful. But now, bit by bit, other voices were giving her pieces of him she had never known. Daniel listened intently, his jaw tight. My dad always said he never thanked Jacob enough. He carried that guilt. Still does. Cal looked at him sharply. That guilt's common. But don't mistake it, your father lived because Jacob wanted him to. We can't rewrite the way things ended. What we can do is honor it. The rancher, the man at the counter, even the cook leaning on the pass-through, all added their own fragments of remembrance, as if the name Jacob Ramsey unlocked a floodgate. Nancy sat still, her heart both breaking and mending at once. For years she had told herself Jacob was gone, that his story ended with the knock on her door. But here, in the middle of a noisy diner filled with eggs and coffee, she realized his story had rippled outward. He lived in the lives of men who came home, in the children born to them, in the bracelets worn down to threads on wrists like Daniel's. She reached for the bracelet again, her fingers trembling. I thought I'd been carrying this alone all these years, she whispered. Daniel placed his hand gently over hers. You haven't, ma'am. Not by a long shot. The moment stretched, full of voices and memories that braided the past into the present. And though Nancy knew the ache of loss would never vanish, something shifted. The silence she had carried for 13 years was no longer hers alone. Others had been carrying pieces of Jacob too. And now, she felt the weight shift, not vanished, but carried on more shoulders than her own. But even as the voices comforted her, Nancy sensed Daniel hadn't told her everything yet. By late morning, the diner no longer felt like just a roadside stop. It had become a gathering point, as if Jacob Ramsey's name had pulled invisible strings through town. The booths filled with curious regulars, veterans with eyes that carried old deserts, neighbors who remembered Jacob's teenage grin, even strangers who leaned closer as if drawn into a circle of memory. The clatter of plates and the smell of bacon were still there, but the conversations bent toward one subject: Jacob and the young man at the window table wearing his bracelet. Nancy felt both exposed and strangely comforted. For years, she had spoken of her son only in fragments, half-sentences to customers who offered sympathy and quickly moved on. But now, memories poured in from others. Men who had served nearby, locals who recalled Jacob's quiet determination, even a trucker who swore Jacob once patched his tire outside the gas station. Every story widened the portrait of her son, reminding her he had belonged not just to her, but to a wider circle of lives. Still, beneath the warmth of shared remembrance, a tension lingered. She could sense it in the way Daniel sat upright, hands clasped on the table as though rehearsing words he hadn't yet spoken. Finally, when a lull passed through the room, he drew a breath and fixed his gaze on her. Mrs. Ramsey, he said quietly, I didn't just stop here by chance. My dad sent me. Nancy's hand, wrapped around her mug, went still. Sent you? Daniel nodded. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness in it, the kind that comes from carrying someone else's burden. He's sick. Worse than he admits to anyone but me. Lungs, mostly. Doctor says it's from years of sand, dust, smoke, things he breathed in overseas. He asked me to come here while he's still able to speak clearly. Said if he waited, he'd lose the chance. The diner seemed to quiet around them. Even the cook paused mid-scramble, leaning against the pass-through with folded arms. Daniel's fingers traced the edge of the bracelet. He told me I had to look you in the eye and say what he couldn't. That your son's sacrifice isn't just a story in our house. It's the reason our house even exists. He said he's lived every day with two truths: gratitude and guilt. Nancy's throat tightened. Guilt. Daniel nodded again. He feels like he took a life he didn't deserve to keep. He never believed he had the right to approach you after Jacob died. He thought his words would only sound hollow. But now he doesn't have much time. He told me, go to her. Make sure she knows Jacob didn't just save me once. He's been saving me every day since. Nancy pressed her palm to her chest, her eyes stinging. For years, she had whispered her own questions into the dark. Why Jacob? Why her boy and not someone else's? Now those same questions echoed in Daniel's father's heart, across 13 years of survival. At the next booth, an older man cleared his throat. He had been silent until now, his weathered face partly hidden under a cap embroidered with a Marine insignia. I knew Jacob too, he said softly. Name's Charles Dwyer. I was there the night he didn't come back. Nancy turned sharply. The name stirred a faint memory. She had seen him once, at the funeral, standing stiff among uniformed men. Charles removed his cap, holding it between his hands. I never spoke to you because I didn't know how. Truth is, we carried Jacob's story like a secret. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. His voice cracked, and for a moment the hard Marine exterior faltered. I was one of the two he pulled out. Your son lifted me with burns on his own arms, shoved me toward the medic, then turned back for Harper. I've lived 13 years thinking, why him? Why not me? The room grew utterly still. Even Daniel looked shaken. He had grown up on his father's version of the story, but hearing another survivor speak it aloud was different. Nancy reached across the table, her hand trembling as it brushed Charles's. You don't need to carry that weight alone. But Charles shook his head. Burden like that never shrinks, ma'am. It just weaves itself into the bones you walk on. A hush pressed over the diner, broken only by the faint scrape of a spoon against porcelain in the kitchen. Then the local pastor, who often came by for pie after Sunday services, rose from his booth. Maybe the reason you all ended up here today is so none of you have to carry it alone anymore. The words settled over them, not as sermon but as invitation. Nancy looked around the diner, at the faces of strangers who suddenly weren't strangers at all. For years, she had sat behind this counter, pouring coffee into cups that held stories she never thought to ask. And now those stories were circling back to her, tethered to Jacob's name. Daniel's eyes shone, though he blinked hard to steady himself. My father will want to know I told you. He'll want to hear that you know he's never forgotten. Maybe, he stopped swallowing. Maybe when he's strong enough, he can come himself. Sit right here with you. Nancy squeezed his hand gently. When he's ready, I'll be here. This diner isn't going anywhere. For the first time that day, Daniel's posture softened. The rigid lines of duty gave way to something closer to peace. The burden of his father's silence was no longer his alone to carry. Still, Nancy felt the ache deep in her chest. Gratitude from strangers did not erase the empty chair at her table at home. Pride in her son's courage did not quiet the longing to hear his voice again. But as she looked at Daniel, at Charles, at the quiet circle forming around her, she realized something vital. Jacob's story had not ended on foreign soil. It had been living quietly all this time, waiting for this moment to gather and be spoken aloud. And though it hurt, it also healed. Nancy thought the hardest truth had already been spoken. She was wrong. By afternoon, the diner's usual rhythm had returned. Plates clattered, children pressed their noses to the glass pastry case, and a group of truckers joked near the counter. Yet around the booth by the window, the world still felt suspended, wrapped in a hush that ordinary noise couldn't break. Nancy sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her, Daniel fidgeted, his gaze moving between the bracelet and the door as if gathering courage. Charles Dwyer had stepped outside to smoke, leaving just the two of them in the booth. Daniel cleared his throat. "There's something else. Something I've carried here for you." He reached into his backpack, pulling out a weathered envelope. The paper was yellowed at the edges, folded so many times the creases had begun to fray. He set it on the table carefully, like it might crumble under careless hands. Nancy's breath caught, her eyes fixed on the writing across the front. She knew it instantly, the careful block letters, the way they are curved just slightly at the bottom. Jacob's handwriting. Her fingers hovered above it, trembling. Where did you get this?" Daniel's voice was hushed. "From my dad. He told me Jacob wrote it before deployment. Gave it to the unit commander who promised to pass it on if he didn't make it back. Somehow it never reached you. My dad kept it all these years, but he said it belonged here with you." Nancy pressed her palm to her mouth. The room blurred as tears filled her eyes. She hadn't expected to ever see new words from her son. For 13 years, she had clung to old letters, reread until the paper wore thin. And now here was something new. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. The envelope split along its creases with a weary whisper, as though the years themselves exhaled. She read silently at first, but soon her voice rose in a trembling whisper. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come home. I don't want you to carry only sorrow when you think of me. I want you to remember the laughter in the garage, the smell of your coffee before school, the way you told me I could do anything if I worked hard enough. Those are the pieces of home I carried with me. And when the time came, I did my best to make sure others got to carry theirs back too. That's enough for me. Don't let my story end with loss. Let it live in the people I loved, and in the ones I saved." Nancy's voice broke on the last line. The diner had gone still. Even the children at the counter had turned, sensing the gravity of her words. She lowered the letter slowly, pressing it against her chest. For years she had wondered what Jacob's last thoughts had been. If he was afraid, if he thought of her. Now, across time, his own words answered. He had thought of home, of her, and he had chosen peace in the face of death. Daniel's eyes glistened. "My dad read that letter every year on your son's birthday. Said it reminded him he wasn't living for himself alone, that every day was borrowed. He wanted me to give it back to you because it was never his to keep." Nancy reached across the table and took Daniel's hand in both of hers. "You've given me more than you know. This heals a piece I thought was gone forever." Around them, the silence gave way to murmurs of respect. The ranchers bowed their heads. The cook wiped at his eyes with the edge of his apron. Even the truckers at the counter fell quiet, the weight of sacrifice settling on everyone present. Charles returned, slipping back into the booth beside Daniel. He listened as Nancy reread the last lines aloud, his weathered face softening. "That's Jacob," he said quietly, "always thinking of others first, even in the end." The envelope split along its creases with a weary whisper, as though the years themselves exhaled. They carried something else, relief, pride, gratitude. For so long, she had carried grief as a locked room inside her heart. Now, with this letter, the door had opened. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him. His earnest face, his steady eyes, the weight he carried for a father who could not speak. And she saw not just the boy her son had saved indirectly, but the living continuation of Jacob's choice. Her voice steadied. "Tell your father I'll be waiting. Tell him this table will be here, and that I don't see a debt. I see a gift Jacob wanted to give. I'm glad it was him your father brought home." Daniel swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. The bracelet lay between them again. Nancy touched it once more, then pushed it back toward Daniel. "This belongs with you. My son's memory is alive in your family. Keep carrying it. That's how his legacy lives." Daniel hesitated, then closed his fingers around it. "Yes, ma'am. I promise." As the afternoon sun angled through the diner windows, The light caught the silver bead, glinting like a small star against the worn cord. Nancy felt warmth spread through her chest, not the heat of sorrow but the glow of remembrance shared. The diner's bell rang as new customers entered, their chatter filling the space again. But for those who had gathered, something had shifted. They carried with them the reminder that sacrifice was not buried with the fallen. It lived on, reshaping lives in quiet, enduring ways. Nancy folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest. After 13 years, Jacob's voice no longer felt like a fading echo of loss, but a presence that would never leave her side. And at that booth, over cooling coffee and shared silence, a mother, a veteran's son, and a survivor carried Jacob's story forward, together. This story reminds us that legacies aren't measured in medals or headlines, but in the lives changed by quiet acts of courage. What would you say if someone walked into your life carrying a piece of the person you lost? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful stories. See you in the next video.